Module 3, Lesson 20's objective is to use place value strategies and the associative property to multiply multiples of 10. Item 2. Solve. Place parentheses in C and D as needed to find the related fact. Item A. 3 times 20 equals or is the same as 3 times 2 times 10. Let's look at that row. The original problem, 3 times 20, was rewritten to be 3 times 2 times 10. Because it is easier to multiply by 10 than 20, the problem was rewritten this way. Because 2 times 10 is the same as 20. Now with the associative property of multiplication, we can move those parentheses. So on the second row, you can see that it is written the same way, but the parentheses have been moved to be around the 3 times 2. 3 times 2 equals 6, and that's why it's written right below it. And then they went ahead and left the 10 from the math problem written above. Because it's super easy to multiply by 10, now we are multiplying 6 times 10 instead of 3 times 20. 3 times 20 is the same as 3 times 2 times 10 because 2 times 10 equals 20. Then 3 times 2 is another easy set of factors to multiply and get the product of 6. So 6 times 10 is the ultimate or easy problem to solve. 6 times 10 is 60. Whenever we multiply by 10, we take the number that we're multiplying it by and throw on 1 0 at the end. Now let's look at item B. 3 times 30 equals or is the same as 3 times 3 times 10. Again, they've turned the number 30 into a tens fact and written it right here because 3 times 10 is the same as 30. It's much easier to multiply by tens than 30s. Now they use the associative property of multiplication and they moved the parentheses. Underneath you can see that they've written 3 times 3 in parentheses and then multiplied by 10. Well, 3 times 3 is the same thing as 3 groups of 3, which looks like this. Here's 3 groups of 3. Now 3 groups of 3 is the same as 3, 6, 9. So 3 times 3 is 9. And then keep the multiply by 10 because it was written in the second line, so we keep it in the third line. Now, use the trick I told you in order to find the ultimate product, the end result. 3 times 30 is the same as 9 times 10. Remember, when multiplying by 10, just simply write down the number that you're multiplying it by and throw on an extra 0 to get the answer. I'll leave that part up to you. Now let's look at item C. 3 times 40 equals or is the same as 3 times 4 times 10. Again, it's easier to multiply by 10 than 40. So they went ahead and wrote a tens fact here that is equivalent to the number 40. 4 times 10 is the same as 40. Now the directions tell us that we're supposed to put parentheses in items C and D as needed to find the related fact. So instead of having the parentheses around 4 times 10, let's use the associative property and relocate those parentheses. Now, we have 3 times 4 times 10. 3 times 4 means 3 groups of 4. So here are my 3 groups. And I'll put 4 items in each group. So 3 times 4 is the same thing as 4, 8, 12. Now 12 times 10. Remember that trick? You write down the number that you're multiplying by 10 and throw on 1 0. So I'll go ahead and write down that 12 again and throw on 1 0. Because 12 times 10 is the same thing as 120. Let's look at item D. 3 times 50 equals or is the same thing as 3 times 5 times 10. They didn't put any parentheses. I know that it's easier to multiply by 10 than it is by 50. So they went ahead and wrote down a tens fact for 50. I see it right here. 5 times 10. 5 times 10 is the same as that 50 right there. Now, look at the example that I've given on C. Where should we put the parentheses for item D? On the second row. You go ahead and put them now. Then you finish the multiplication part on your own. Finally, let's look at item 3. Danny solves 5 times 20 by thinking about 10 times 10. Explain his strategy. I'll go ahead and use an equation like those that are shown above. 5 times 20 is the same thing as 5 times, it's easier to multiply by 10 than 20, so I'll make a tens fact. 2 times 10. 2 times 10 is the same thing as this 20. Now I'll use the associative property and move the parentheses. That's the same thing as 5 times 2 times 10. I know that 5 times 2 is 10, and then bring down the times 10. And 10 times 10 is 100. Over here I'll write down that Danny used the associative property to solve the problem.